Hello and welcome to Nature Life Online, the show where we bring the Natural History Museum in London straight to your homes. From the dinosaurs in our galleries to the giant squids in the basement, we chat with scientists from the museum and also all around the world. Today's show revolves around carbon and how it moves between the atmosphere, the sea, and living organisms. And as always, as we chat, send questions and comments because we all love to hear from you. To chat with us today, we are joined by Sarah Alewijnse, who is a researcher, a postgraduate researcher student at the museum and the National Oceanographic Centre in Southampton. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, Christina. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Now, as I said before, we're going to be talking about the carbon cycle today and its role in our planet, and also about what's going to be the star of the day, a particular fish that you're studying. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about carbon. Can you tell us a little bit more about the carbon cycle and what is it and how is it work? Does it work?
Yeah, of course. So with COP26 going on as we speak, we're obviously all thinking a lot about the carbon in our atmosphere in the form of CO2 and the effect that that's having on our climate. But carbon is pretty much everywhere within the ecosphere. So not only is it in the atmosphere, but also within living things. It makes up a lot of our tissues, what we call our biomass. But carbon is also in the seas. So as waves start breaking, that water kind of gets mixed in with the atmosphere, with the air, and that carbon, that CO2 actually gets dissolved within the surface of the ocean. And this is happening all the time. And that carbon, much like on land, gets taken up by phytoplankton, essentially very small plant-like organisms within the sea. And they then in turn get eaten by zooplankton, so small animals, and then those get eaten by things like fish, which is what I'm particularly interested in.
Absolutely. So, as you said, Sarah, carbon and its cycle might be in our heads recently with COP26 and everything that is happening with our planet. But I'm glad that you mentioned how it happens in our planet and all around the world naturally, and it goes through this cycle naturally. Um, Now, it is important to understand that what we are doing is just adding more carbon to this cycle. So that's why people might have heard about carbon sequestration or carbon capture, because we're trying to understand if we can revert a little bit what we're putting in the atmosphere. Now that we've seen the cycle of carbon there, Sarah, tell us a little bit more about the start of the show today. We're going to be talking about a particular fish that you're studying, the lanternfish. Can you tell us more a little bit more about this particular fish?
Yeah, so lanternfish are really amazing little animals. They're quite small. The biggest ones I work on are about 20 centimeters long, but that's really quite big for a lanternfish. They have these beautiful photophores along their body, which is actually how you ID them, is through that pattern. And they are super abundant. So they're the second most abundant vertebrates on the whole of the earth. Yeah, so there's a lot of them out there.
We've got a few, so we've seen a lovely drawing, I think, of the lanternfish here, but we've got more pictures there. They are actually quite remarkable, and as you said, they have that ability to bioluminescence, so to to create light and luminescence. But aside from being quite cute, Sarah, can you tell us a little bit more about the role in the carbon cycle?
Yeah, so a lot of species of lanternfish, like many other deep water, mid-water fish, they do what we call diel vertical migration, which is a fancy phrase which just means uh, during the day they are hiding out in the deep waters in the ocean, trying to avoid predators that rely on light, so things like seabirds. And then at night, under the cover of darkness, they will come up to the surface of the ocean to feed on those zooplankton. And then when day breaks again, they go back down again. So many species do this almost on a daily basis, and we call it actually the largest migration on Earth. And it's happening every single day. All these fish and invertebrates coming up to the surface and then going back down to the deep again.
That's amazing. And I love that the name of it, the largest migration, because we tend to think about migrations about traveling all across the world, and maybe traveling from different continents even. We hear about butterflies, birds, but you don't think about fish migration vertically. And
Yeah.
it's really important. That migration is really, really important. It has a very important role in the carbon cycle as well, doesn't it? So let's see if through one of our diagrams we can see a little bit more about what's going on there with lanternfishes, but also other animals that do that migration. We talk about how carbon is absorbed by our seas naturally. So what is the role of lanternfish and other animals in the carbon cycle in the oceans?
Yeah, so as we kind of talked about, CO2 is constantly sort of coming in and out of our oceans, and some of that is then taken up by these phytoplankton and taken into the tissues of the phytoplankton. Those are then eaten by things like zooplankton, like this nice copepod we've got here, and then those are eaten by fish like the lanternfish. Now, as the lanternfish do things like respire, so burn that energy as they die and they poop, that carbon is then released back into the water, and if it's up at the surface, will come out into the atmosphere. However, given they're doing these really big vertical migrations, if they go below a certain depth, which varies throughout the oceans, and then they again poop and die and respire, that carbon gets trapped within the ocean. Can be from the order of 100 to thousands of years that carbon is stored away from the atmosphere.
That's amazing. And Sarah, I think I found it amazing when I found out about it by chatting to you, because when we think about carbon sequestration, carbon capture, we might have heard about people planting trees or relying a lot on plants for this carbon sequestration, but it happens not only happens naturally on land with plants, but it's happening in our oceans, just in the way that you're explaining right now. That is really, really amazing. Um, is this something that it's a really important impact on the carbon sequestration that is happening in our land, we think?
Yeah, so the oceans are doing us a huge favor because, as we know, we're all emitting carbon through things like fossil fuels. And it's estimated that between a quarter and a third of all the carbon that we emit is actually taken up by our oceans. So, yeah, they play a really, really big role in helping to sort of mitigate our impacts on the climate.
So hopefully people are excited, as excited as I am about hearing about this. I just want to remind everyone watching that you're more than welcome to post questions on the chat as well, and comments if you want to ask anything about this wonderful topic to Sarah. So pop it on the chat, and we will try to get through as many as possible. Also, if you're enjoying the show, please consider making a donation to support the work that we do at the museum. So you can do it through clicking the button that is by the chat on YouTube, or you can go directly to our website, and we'll put a link on the chat. But yeah, send your question through, because I've got loads of other questions for Sarah. And another question that I've got for you, Sarah, is about your work. So we've been talking about the carbon cycle, carbon sequestration, the little lanternfish. But what is your research about? Are you studying this particular topic, and why are you studying it?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in lanternfish and trying to work out how much of a contribution they actually make to this carbon sequestration, because we don't really have that good a handle on it at the moment. There's a ton of really good research going into things like what we call particle flux, so things like fish poop and dead invertebrates. It's sort of raining down in the form of what we call marine snow. Um, whereas actually the amount of sort of cycling that these fish are helping to carry out, we don't really have a good handle on it. So my research is looking to try and pin that down a bit better.
Absolutely, and hopefully that will help us understand a little bit more how this fish and other fish can reverse a little bit the huge impact that we're having in our planet by releasing more carbon to the atmosphere that we can actually deal with. And that's something that I wanted to talk to you about, Sarah. So we've been talking about the carbon cycle, the sequestration, but I think it's important to talk about the impact that we are having on our planet and how can it affect these kind of natural carbon sequestration processes that are happening in nature. So we're definitely suffering climate change at the moment. Temperatures are going up. Is climate change affecting the carbon sequestration that lanternfish and other fish are doing in our oceans?
Yeah, so that's something we're trying to get a handle on at the moment. Fish and other kind of aquatic life forms are actually really quite at risk from climate change, because not only do they have to deal with things like the rising temperatures, but those temperatures increasing actually means that they need to consume more oxygen in order to just kind of carry out their really basic functions of, swimming around, finding mates, finding food. But at the same time, warm water doesn't hold as much oxygen. So there's becoming certain parts of the oceans that for certain aquatic species, the amount of oxygen in the water isn't really enough to sustain them. And so we're seeing fish potentially migrating to new areas and leaving certain areas. And that potentially has an impact on things like the carbon sequestration, but also on things like fisheries. We've seen particularly in the North Sea, so polar species are getting kind of forced out by these more temperate species as everything is kind of moving towards the poles where it's a bit cooler.
Absolutely. And are there any other impacts that we are having, that we're doing on our planet? Any other impact that we could be having on fish? One of the things that it comes immediately into my mind is maybe overfishing. We know that that is a problem. We are overfishing in our oceans, in our seas. Is this something that could affect lanternfish as well? Although I've never seen them in the supermarket. I don't know if they get affected by this too.
Yeah, so lanternfish, luckily for them, most of them, we can't actually eat them because they have a really high wax ester content, which they use for things like energy and also staying buoyant. So lots of lanternfish don't have swim bladders, they use sort of fats instead. But they basically, if you eat them, you get a really horrible condition called kyria, which is basically oily orange diarrhea, which you do not want. So that's why you won't have seen them in the supermarket. However, there is a lot of interest kind of growing in using them as feedstock for aquaculture. So a lot of the fish that we farm, fish like salmon, are carnivorous fish. They're quite high up on the food chain. So although you can feed them plant-based diets, people are getting more and more interested in using something like lanternfish, which people see as being, well, they're so abundant that what impact could we possibly have on them? But if we did start fishing them, we might then start to disrupt that carbon cycling that they're doing for us. The other key use that people are looking at for lanternfish is things like fish oil, omega-3s, these kind of nutritional supplements that there is actually quite a lot of money in. So although it hasn't started yet, the lanternfish fishery, it is definitely something that I think is on the horizon.
And Sarah, so after we've talking about this impact that we can have on landfish and other animals and living organisms that are capturing carbon in the sea, what would be the effect on disrupting the carbon cycle and the carbon sequestration processes that are happening in the sea? What would be the effect that we'll have in our planet if that would happen?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the oceans are taking up between a quarter and a third of all the carbon that we're emitting into the atmosphere. So, yeah, if this were to be disrupted, that could potentially mean that carbon we were talking about coming in and out of the atmosphere, instead of getting stored in the deep sea, it's then going to come back out into the atmosphere and then contribute to that warming where it otherwise wouldn't. So this could potentially have really serious effects. And at the moment, when we're kind of thinking about managing fisheries and thinking about managing them sustainably, we're mostly thinking about, like, okay, can we leave enough fish so that they can reproduce and we can fish them again? But actually, we need to think about, we need to leave enough fish so that they can carry out this service for us. Otherwise, we could start seeing, CO2 concentrations going up more rapidly, because that kind of, that capture service wouldn't be happening. Similarly to if we were to, as we have been, cutting down a load of trees and reducing the amount of carbon stored in trees, that is also contributing to CO2 rise.
So it's not about slowing down our own carbon emissions into the atmosphere. It's also allowing the rest of the planet to continue the natural processes that allow that carbon to be part of a cycle and capture in different parts of our ecosystems, and that's really important. But Sarah, one of the things, as we mentioned before, and especially now with COP26 happening at the moment, we hear a lot about carbon sequestration, carbon capture, and we hear about efforts of relying on these processes of carbon sequestration to actually control the levels of carbon in our atmosphere. How much can we rely on these processes, and not only the ones that we hear about, so planting trees, but putting a lot of pressure on the carbon sequestration in our seas, in the role of fish like lanternfish, for example?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. Because there is a lot of talk about, particularly with COP26. That there is a lot of talk about what we call blue carbon, so things like particularly coastal systems, so mangroves, seagrasses, but we don't tend to think about kind of the deep ocean and how that impacts and is really doing us a huge favor. And then we also think more terrestrially. We can think about things like planting trees. So there's been a really big push to plants lots of trees, and I'm a big believer that we kind of need to do as much as we can to try and mitigate and stop climate change as much as we can. But I think with that comes not relying on any one system. So I don't, lanternfish are just a very, they're a very important part, but a small part of this huge global system. And like you say, they've been doing this, for, ages and ages before we came around and started putting carbon into the atmosphere. So natural systems aren't really designed, but these systems weren't designed for us to be emitting all the fossil fuels that we are, and it's that kind of throwing us off balance that is really having an impact. I think the key thing for me is to get a handle on, okay, if we are going to harvest these fish, how can we do it in a way that isn't going to disrupt the carbon cycle any more than it already has been? How can we preserve that? And then, looking at all the other ways that we can mitigate our CO2 emissions. So, things like planting trees, restoring coastal habitats like seagrass, and then also, enabling people to make the more sustainable decisions like having good public transport systems, all that, good kind of stuff. I think we really need to pull on all those strings in order to, give ourselves the best future in the face of climate change.
I think you said something that really, really important. We really need to truly understand these systems to actually know what effect they have on the carbon cycle on our planet, but also the impact that we're having on them. So it's fantastic to hear about your research and the work you're doing on that. I think it's really important to take that we can't overload those systems. They happen naturally. But I think you said a word really important there. There's a balance there, and we are we're having an impact on that balance, and we are destroying that balance. So that is that is really really important. Sarah, what do you think are the next steps to take, especially in your research? You're studying these, you're trying to understand these processes. So what are your next steps, and also what do you think the general next steps that we should take are?
Yeah, so I'm hoping to continue this research after my PhD finishes in a few months. But yeah, what I'd really like to do, I've mostly been focusing on lanternfish from a really specific area in the Southern Ocean, so very cold environments. And I'm interested in kind of expanding that out, looking at, because lanternfish are all over the world, so looking at lanternfish in the tropics and in temperate regions. And thinking about in which areas are they, doing this carbon capture the most, and also, in which, you know, in which areas would the trade-off will we be able to make that trade-off for sustainable fishing, because fishing is really important. A lot of people rely on it for their livelihoods, for their protein. It's actually a really quite sort of low carbon protein source, especially when you compare it to things like beef and pork. So yeah, that's where I'm really interested in going with it, is sort of taking more global view and looking at the sort of socio ecological side and how humans interact with our environment. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Now, Sarah, we're getting slowly to the end of the show, but we had a question coming from our viewers. Noah, who is 7 and always watches our shows, they were asking, what happens when the lanternfish get eaten? So I can imagine they mean in the ocean, but we were talking about that carbon cycle, and how when they die. But what happens when they get eaten by any other animals? Does that carbon cycle continues, or does it get disrupted in any way?
Yeah, so thank you, Noah. That's a really good question. Yeah, it depends what they get eaten by. So in the Southern Ocean, where I'm focusing, lanternfish are really important for all kinds of these sort of big, charismatic animals. Things like your lovely whales, seabirds as well. Really, go for lanternfish. So if you imagine something like a seabird eating a lanternfish, then yeah, that carbon could be then released back into the atmosphere. But seabirds also are quite helpful for carbon storage with their poop. And like you'll probably have heard of guano, these huge mounds of seabird poo that you end up with, particularly in the Southern Ocean, actually. Those can store a lot of carbon. If it's something like a whale and the whale were to eat the lanternfish, depending on what then happens, whales obviously have to come to the surface to breathe, so that would then get released. But also, when whales die and fall to the seafloor, that's actually a really, really huge carbon sink, as is their poop, because whales do such big poos. Their poop sinks really quickly, and that makes them a really, really important kind of they're also contributing to this carbon cycle. So yeah, in summary, it really depends what it's getting eaten by and what that animal is doing. But yeah, kind of every animal in this ecosystem has a role to play in the carbon cycle for sure.
And it's amazing. It's just purely a pure cycle, with loads of different arrows pointed on different things, but we can see really clearly here how it is a cycle. And going back to that balance that you were talking about, Sarah, and how we are disrupting that balance, is definitely us. So we need to try and go back to that. That was an excellent question. If anyone has any other questions, we've got a few minutes left of the show as well to answer those questions. But before we finish the show as well, Sarah, I wanted to ask you and wrap up the show with a bit of a big question, actually. But what do you think, from your point of view, is is the solution to the problem that we're having at the moment with our the levels of carbons in the atmosphere, and the different solutions that we're trying to find, and that balance that we were talking about, and how we are disrupting it. Is it a clear solution, or is it many things that need to come together in order to find that balance again?
Yeah, that is a big question. I think it's many things. So there's a lot of talk at the moment about kind of the value of individual actions versus systemic change. And I think both have a place. I think if we are to sort of overcome climate change and mitigate it and manage it, we are going to need that those big systemic changes. But actually, doing the small personal things can, I think, help you on your way quite a bit. So, for instance, I always try to get the bus everywhere, even though the buses in Southampton are not great. But I think, well, if I'm doing this, then I'm going to take the time to write, to my elected representative and ask them to push for, more climate measures. So yeah, it's really, truly, I think, a combination of all these things. So things like not disrupting the carbon cycle, restoring those carbon sink habitats like seagrasses and mangroves, and then, yeah, enabling people to take those options. So having things like a really good public transport system, because often these sort of individual changes can be quite exclusionary for a lot of people. So making them as easy as possible, I think, is going to be a really big push to the future. And then, yeah, just understanding these systems as well as we can, so that we know kind of how far we can push them, what we can take for them, because we do need to take from natural systems in order to survive, but how we can do that in a way that considers all the services that they provide is really important.
I was gonna say, actually, invest in research like the one that you're doing, Sarah, to understand the systems better, and understand how we can rely on them, and work with them without disrupting that balance. Because I think the work that you're doing, the work that all the scientists in your field are doing, is really, really important. But with that, we've reached the end of the show today. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully see you again in the future when you've got more information about that amazing work that you're doing. I'm going to say goodbye to you now. Bye bye, Sarah.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, as well, for watching and being there behind the screen and sending your questions. They were fantastic. If you enjoyed the show, remember that you can support the work that we do at the Natural History Museum by giving us a donation, which you can do by clicking the button on by the YouTube chat if you're watching from there. And if you're watching from any other social media platform, you can go straight to our website, and we'll put a link so you can donate there and support the museum. But that's all from us today. But as you know, Nature Live Online will be back next Tuesday, where my colleague Alistair will be chatting with scientist Jess Miller, who got trapped in Antarctica when the pandemic hit. So if you want to know more about that adventure, join us next Tuesday at the same time, 1 p.m. And we'll see you then. Take care. Bye.